Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The sun was a hammer, and the land was an anvil. It beat the moisture from the air, cracked the soil into a mosaic of thirst, and baked the very color from the tall grasses, leaving them a uniform, ghostly tan. For the settlers of Perseverance Creek, this heat was a promise and a threat. It was the promise of a harvest, of life wrested from a reluctant earth. But it was also a threat, a silent countdown to the other hammer, the one made of ice and wind, that would inevitably fall in a few short months. Aniela Kowalski felt that countdown in her bones. She felt it in the ache of her back as she drew water from the well her husband Jakub had dug before the fever took him in the spring. She saw it in the worried eyes of her 7-year-old son Stanislaw, whose small face was already learning the hard geometry of survival. They were alone, an island of grief and uncertainty on a 15-acre plot of land that was more rock than soil. The cabin Jakub had built was a testament to his hope, not his skill. It was small, drafty, and its log walls were chinked with a mixture of mud and grass that Aniela knew would crumble and betray them at the first sign of a real frost. She was an outsider twice over, a woman alone in a world of men and married couples, and a Pole in a community of Germans, Scandinavians, and Americans who saw her accent as a mark of strangeness and her silence as a sign of weakness. They looked at her with a kind of pity that felt sharper than scorn. They saw a liability. They saw a future charity case, a woman and a boy who would be knocking on their doors come January, begging for a share of their firewood, a corner by their stove. She saw their glances at the town mercantile, heard the whispers that followed her like a shadow. The Polish widow. It was a title that felt like a verdict. Her resources were dwindling. A handful of coins in a jar, a half-empty sack of flour, a small garden of root vegetables that were her only real hope. The woodpile, stacked neatly by Jakub's dying hands, looked impossibly small against the vast, empty horizon. She knew, with the cold certainty of a mathematician, that it would not be enough. It would not last past December. The conventional wisdom of Perseverance Creek was simple and brutal. Chop wood. Spend the autumn months creating a mountain of fuel to feed the insatiable god of the iron stove. A man could spend his entire autumn swinging an axe and still feel the cold creeping in. Aniela had no man, and her own strength, though considerable, was finite. Chopping wood was a race she could not win. The town's expert, the man whose opinion was treated as gospel, was a builder named Mr. Thompson. He was a large man with a voice that seemed to carry its own authority. His houses were considered the best in the county, stout, square, with thick walls and stone fireplaces that consumed cords of wood with magnificent inefficiency. He had looked at her cabin once, after Jakub's passing, and shaken his head with a sigh that was meant to convey both sympathy and professional disdain. "You'll need 4 cords of oak to see you through, missus," he'd declared, as if stating a law of physics. "Maybe 5 with these gaps." 4 cords of wood was a forest she did not own and could not afford. Her hope, and her problem, lay in the earth. The root cellar Jakub had dug was a shallow, damp pit lined with rotting timbers. It was barely 4 feet deep, a dark mouth in the ground that smelled of mold. Already, the few potatoes she had stored there were beginning to soften. It was a place of decay, not preservation. It was a failure. One evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of fire and sorrow, Aniela stood before this pit. Stanislaw was inside the cabin, asleep. The world was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets. She looked at the pathetic cellar, then at the vast, indifferent land stretching out before her. And in that moment of quiet desperation, her mind did not go to her neighbors, or to the town, or to some prayer for a mild winter. It went back. It traveled thousands of miles and a decade into the past, to the landscape of her childhood near Krakow. It went underground. She remembered the stories, the feeling, the very air of the great salt mines at Wieliczka. She had been taken there as a girl, a journey into the heart of the earth. She remembered the awe of descending into a world carved from salt, a place where the seasons did not exist. She recalled the guides explaining that deep in the earth, the temperature was eternal. It was a constant coolness, a gentle, unwavering embrace that knew nothing of the brutal Polish winters or the fleeting summers raging on the surface. It was a place of perfect preservation. Chapels, statues, entire rooms carved from salt remained unchanged for centuries, held in the earth's steady hand. She also remembered the cellars of her village, not the shallow pits for a few weeks' worth of potatoes, but the deep cellars, the ones dug by generations of the same family, caverns pushed 20 or 30 feet into the clay and rock, where barrels of sauerkraut, wheels of cheese, and strings of dried sausage hung in a timeless, subterranean chill. These were not just holes, they were sanctuaries. They were places where the harvest was not just stored, but protected, kept safe from the war of the seasons. The earth was not a grave, it was a larder, it was a womb. A new idea began to form in her mind, not as a flash of brilliance, but as a slow, deep certainty. It was an idea so contrary to the local custom that it felt like a form of madness. Everyone in the Dakotas built up, fighting the cold with thicker walls and bigger fires. They built fortresses of wood against the winter. But a fortress required constant defense, an endless supply of ammunition in the form of firewood. It was a war of attrition. What if the goal was not to fight the winter? What if the goal was to simply step out of its way? She would not build up. She would dig down. Not just a better root cellar, not a hole for potatoes. She would dig a home. A room deep in the earth connected to her cabin. A space deep enough to be below the frost line. That imaginary frontier where the surface cold finally lost its grip and surrendered to the planet's stable, deep warmth. She would carve a sanctuary not from logs, but from the very ground she stood upon. She would live in the cellar. The next morning, she began. She took Jakub's spade and pickaxe, tools that felt both heavy and familiar in her hands, and she returned to the shallow pit. She did not try to widen it. She simply began to go deeper. The work was brutal. The first few feet were dry topsoil, but then she hit a dense layer of clay, studded with rocks that had to be patiently, painfully pried loose. Each shovelful of earth was a victory. She filled a bucket, climbed a rickety ladder out of the deepening hole, dumped the earth, and descended again. It was a slow, punishing rhythm. Dig, pry, lift, climb, dump, descend. Her son Stan watched her with a child's unquestioning loyalty. He helped in his small way, hauling away the smaller rocks, bringing her water. He did not ask why she was digging. He simply saw that his mother was engaged in a great and serious work, and he trusted her. His trust was a small, warm flame in the growing gloom of the community's judgment. It did not take long for the town to notice. Her trips to the mercantile became ordeals of sideways glances and hushed comments. The pile of excavated earth next to her cabin grew into a small hill, a monument to what they called Aniela's folly. They saw a woman, clearly broken by grief, digging her own grave. It was unnatural. A woman's work was in the cabin, at the hearth, in the garden. This subterranean obsession was a perversion of the natural order. Pity curdled into a kind of morbid fascination, then into outright scorn. "She's digging to China," one man joked at the blacksmith's forge. "More like digging her own tomb," another replied. Sad thing. The boy, too. The children in the small settlement were cruelest of all, as children often are. They would sometimes creep to the edge of her property and chant rhymes about the crazy Polish witch who lived in a hole. Stan heard them. He would clench his small fists, his face tight with a shame he did not understand. And Aniela would simply pull him close, wipe the dirt from her brow, and say in Polish, "Let them talk. Their words cannot stop the winter. Our work can." After 3 weeks of relentless labor, the hole was over 10 feet deep. She had learned to brace the walls with scavenged timber. She had hit a layer of soft shale that was easier to chip away than the clay had been. The air at the bottom of the pit was different. It was cool and smelled of damp stone and minerals. When the August sun beat down on the surface, turning the air into a shimmering haze, the bottom of her hole remained placid and cool. It was working. The earth was keeping its promise. One afternoon, as she was hauling up a bucket of shale, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Mr. Thompson standing at the edge of the pit, his arms crossed over his substantial chest. His face was a mask of stern disapproval. "Mistress Kowalski," he began, his voice devoid of its usual boom, replaced by a tone of grave concern. "I have come as a friend, and as a man who knows how to build in this land. You have to stop this." Aniela said nothing. She simply climbed the ladder, emerging from the earth into the harsh sunlight, her dress stained with dirt and sweat. She stood before him, smaller, leaner, yet radiating an energy that seemed to unnerve him. "This is madness," he continued, gesturing at the hole. "The first heavy rain, and this whole thing will collapse on you. You're digging in unstable ground. You'll hit groundwater. You're wasting precious time. The nights are getting cooler. You should be splitting wood. Your pile is no bigger than it was a month ago." He was not being cruel. In his own mind, he was being logical, practical, even kind. He was the voice of convention, of established wisdom, of the hard-won experience of the settlers who had come before. He was trying to save her from herself. Aniela looked at Mr. Thompson, then at the growing pile of earth, then toward the horizon where the winter was gathering its forces. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear, her accent making the simple words sound ancient and strange to his ears. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "you see the ground as a floor to build on. I see it as a blanket to wrap in." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "A blanket? It's a tomb! It's cold, it's damp. People get sick from the damp. You need sunlight, you need a fire, a proper fire, in a proper hearth." She nodded slowly, as if considering his words, though her mind was already made up. She chose her next words carefully, translating a deep, intuitive concept into his language. "The earth has 2 temperatures, Mr. Thompson. On the surface, it has the sun's temperature and the wind's temperature. That is the one that changes, the one that kills. But deep down," she pointed a dirt-caked finger toward her hole, "deep down, the earth has only its own temperature. That one, it does not change. That is the one that keeps. I am looking for the one that keeps." He was not wrong, but his knowledge was incomplete. His experience was only with the surface, with the thin, volatile skin of the planet where life was a constant battle against the elements. He understood insulation as something you added to a wall, a layer of sod, a packing of moss. He thought of it as a barrier. He could not conceive of insulation as an entire planet. The narrative of survival in the Dakotas was written in the language of fire. A home's worth was measured by its hearth, a family's security by the size of its woodpile. Heat was a thing you made, a manufactured commodity wrested from the forest with axe and saw. It was a flickering, temporary victory against an infinite cold, a victory that had to be won again every single day. The central flaw in this logic, a flaw no one in Perseverance Creek had ever stopped to consider, was one of profound inefficiency. A log cabin, even one built by Mr. Thompson, was a thermal sieve. Wood is a poor insulator. An 8-inch thick log wall has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 10. For comparison, a modern insulated wall is often R20 or higher. Heat, like any form of energy, seeks equilibrium. It moves from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Inside a cabin in winter, the air is warm. Outside, it is lethally cold. The heat inside the cabin, therefore, wants only one thing: to escape. It bled through the wooden walls by conduction. It slipped through the tiny, inevitable gaps in the chinking via convection. It radiated out through the single-paned glass windows. The iron stove, the very heart of the home, was the greatest traitor. Most of the heat it generated went straight up the chimney and out into the winter sky, a plume of wasted energy. Keeping a cabin warm was like trying to fill a leaky bucket. You had to keep pouring in energy, in the form of firewood, faster than it could drain out. It was a wasteful, exhausting, and ultimately precarious way to live. Aniela Kowalski, through a combination of inherited wisdom and desperate ingenuity, had rejected this entire premise. She was not trying to fill a leaky bucket. She was tapping into an ocean. The principle she was leveraging is now known as geothermal heat exchange. But to her, it was simply the Earth's deep, steady breath. Below the frost line, which in the Dakotas can be 4 to 6 feet deep, the ground maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round. This temperature is an average of the region's annual air temperature, typically between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a massive thermal battery, a reservoir of coolness in the summer, and, more importantly, a reservoir of mildness in the winter. When the air outside is 20 degrees below zero, 55 degrees is a life-saving warmth. It isn't hot, but it is fundamentally survivable. Her plan was to build a space within this thermal battery. By digging her chamber 12 feet down, she was placing her family entirely within this zone of stability. The tons of earth surrounding her dwelling on all sides but one were not a threat. They were her insulation. The R value of 12 feet of dirt is nearly infinite. Heat loss through her earthen walls and ceiling would be negligible. The only significant point of loss would be the entrance, which connected to the drafty cabin above. She wasn't just digging a hole, she was engineering a system. As she dug deeper, she began to tunnel horizontally, carving out a rectangular chamber roughly 10 feet by 12 feet. She used the shale she excavated to line parts of the floor and walls, creating a drier, more stable surface. She devised a clever ventilation system, a narrow shaft angled upwards toward the back of the chamber and emerging far from the cabin, would allow stale air to escape, while fresh air would be drawn down through the entrance. This created a gentle, constant airflow, preventing the dampness and stagnation that Mr. Thompson had warned of. Her final, most crucial innovation was how she planned to heat the space. She did not need a roaring fireplace. She needed only to raise the ambient temperature from a stable 55 degrees to a comfortable 68 or 70. For this, she acquired a small, efficient cast-iron laundry stove, one that required only small scraps of wood. By placing it in her subterranean room, the vast majority of the heat it produced would stay in the room, gently warming the air and, more importantly, being absorbed and radiated back by the immense thermal mass of the surrounding Earth. The Earth itself would become her radiator. She was not fighting the cold, she was simply ignoring it, living in a separate climate of her own creation. While her neighbors were trying to heat the entire Dakota Territory with their leaky fireplaces, Agnella was just gently warming a small, perfectly insulated box. Mr. Thompson saw a woman digging a grave. Agnella was building a thermal battery. The people of Perseverance Creek saw a monument to folly. Agnella was building a fortress of physics. They trusted in the brute force of fire. She trusted in the quiet, unyielding power of the earth. By mid-October, the work was done. The subterranean chamber was complete, connected to the cabin's floor by a steep, sturdy ladder staircase she had built. From the outside, nothing looked different except for the large pile of earth, now covered with transplanted sod, and the thin wisp of smoke that occasionally curled from a narrow, stone-lined vent pipe nearly 50 feet from the cabin itself. Inside the cabin, a trap door in the floor, covered by a bearskin rug, was the only sign of the world below. The community had moved on from scorn to a kind of resigned pity. They stopped talking about her. They had their own preparations to worry about. The first snows fell in early November, a light dusting that melted by midday. But the old-timers, the ones who read the sky like a book, saw the signs. The way the geese flew south, the thickness of the beaver pelts, the unusual color of the sunsets. It was going to be a hard winter. They nodded grimly to each other. A wolf winter, they called it. He was not wrong. The first week of January, 1884, the sky turned the color of lead. The air grew still and heavy, and a strange, oppressive silence fell over the plains. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon. That night, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that slowly rose to a demonic shriek. The wolf had arrived. It came not as a storm, but as a siege. They would later call it the White Hurricane, a blizzard of such ferocity that it would become the benchmark for all future winters, a new entry in the folklore of suffering. For 2 weeks, the world vanished. There was no sky, no land, only a churning, horizontal chaos of wind and snow. Drifts piled up against cabins, burying windows, then doors, then entire structures, turning the settlement into a collection of featureless white mounds. The temperature plunged to 30, then 40 degrees below zero, a cold so profound it felt like a physical presence, an invisible predator hunting for any crack, any weakness. Inside Mr. Thompson's well-built house, life had shrunk to a small, desperate circle around the great stone fireplace. Despite its size, it was losing the battle. The heat it produced was snatched away by the drafts that seemed to spring from the walls themselves. Frost coated the inside of the windows, thick and opaque. Then it began to creep across the floor, away from the hearth. Soon, the walls themselves were coated in a fine, glittering layer of ice. Mr. Thompson and his family lived in a 10-foot bubble of warmth in a house that was otherwise freezing. They wore all their clothes, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The woodpile, which had seemed a mountain in autumn, was melting like snow in spring. Every trip to the woodshed was a life-threatening expedition, a frantic, freezing scramble through a tunnel dug in the snow. They burned wood constantly, a frantic offering to a god who gave them less and less in return. His livestock in the barn, which he could no longer reach, were a lost cause. The sound of the wind was a constant, deafening roar, the sound of a world being torn apart. 13 feet below that same roaring world, Agnella Kowalski and her son Stanislaw were in a different reality. Down the ladder, through the trap door, the storm did not exist. There was no wind. There was only a profound, enveloping silence. The air was cool, but not cold. It was the steady, neutral temperature of a cave. In the center of their earthen room, the small laundry stove glowed with a gentle, ruddy warmth. A handful of kindling and a few small logs every few hours were all it required to keep the chamber at a comfortable temperature, warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves. The heat radiated from the stove, was absorbed by the earthen walls, and then radiated gently back, creating an even, pleasant warmth that filled the entire space. A single kerosene lamp cast a soft, golden light on the scene, and Yella was mending one of Stan's shirts. Stan himself was sitting at a small wooden table, practicing his letters on a slate. Their potatoes, carrots, and beets were stored in bins carved directly into the far wall, perfectly preserved in the constant chill. Slabs of cured bacon and strings of dried apples hung from the timbered ceiling. They had food. They had warmth. They had peace. Occasionally, a faint, deep rumble would transmit through the earth, the only hint of the elemental fury raging on the surface. To Stan, it sounded like a distant, sleeping giant snoring in its sleep. He was not afraid. He was safe. He was home. They were not merely surviving, they were living. When the storm finally broke, it was as if the world was being born again. The wind died, the snow stopped, and a brilliant, merciless sun shone down on a landscape that was utterly transformed. It was a world of white, a place of stunning beauty and lethal consequence. For 2 days, no one in Perseverance Creek stirred. They were digging out, assessing the damage, counting their losses. Mr. Thompson's family was alive, but only just. They had burned the last of their firewood, and then a chair, and then the boards from a spare bed. 2 of his cows and all of his chickens had frozen solid in the barn. His face was gaunt, his hands raw with frostbite. His confidence, the bedrock of his identity, had been shattered. His methods, the conventional wisdom he had championed, had failed him. As the shock wore off, a grim thought began to gnaw at him. The Polish widow. He assumed the worst. A woman and a boy, alone in that flimsy cabin. They couldn't possibly have survived. It was a tragedy, another hard lesson the territory taught its inhabitants. But he had to be sure. On the 3rd day, pulling on his heavy coat, he made his way across the transformed landscape toward her property. The snow was packed hard, sculpted by the wind into waves and ridges. The journey was exhausting. As he neared her plot, he saw it. A thin, almost invisible curl of smoke, rising calmly into the frigid air. It wasn't coming from the cabin's main chimney, which was buried in a drift. It was coming from the strange little vent pipe he had noticed in the autumn, 50 feet away. He was confused. He pushed on, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a strange, unfamiliar hope. He reached the cabin and saw that the front was almost completely buried. He slogged around to the back and saw a narrow trench dug from the door. And then, the door opened. Aniela stood there. She was not haggard. She was not freezing. She was calm. Behind her, Stan peeked out, his face rosy and healthy. Mr. Thompson was speechless. He stared at them, then at the flimsy-looking cabin, then back at them. It made no sense. It violated every law of survival he knew. "How?" he finally managed to croak, his voice hoarse. "By God, woman, how are you alive?" Aniela did not smile. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, quiet weariness. "We did not fight the winter, Mr. Thompson," she said simply. "We went where it could not follow. Will you come in?" He nodded, dumbly. He followed her into the cabin. It was cold, almost as cold as the air outside. A bearskin rug lay on the floor. She bent down and pulled it aside, revealing the trap door. She opened it, and a wave of mild, clean air rose to meet them. It was not hot, but it was the most welcoming warmth he had ever felt. It was the feeling of life. He hesitated, then descended the steep staircase. The transition was instantaneous and absolute. The biting chill vanished, replaced by a gentle, stable warmth. The oppressive silence of the snow-covered world was replaced by an even deeper, more profound quiet. The air smelled of earth, of burning wood, of cooking food. He saw the small glowing stove, the sleeping cot, the bins of vegetables. He saw the boy, Stan, sitting comfortably at his table. It was a sanctuary. It was impossible. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it flat against the earthen wall. He had expected it to be frozen, or at least damp and icy. It was not. It was cool, yes, but it was a living coolness. It felt solid, permanent. In that single tactile moment, his entire worldview collapsed. All his expertise, all his rules, all his hard-won knowledge, it was all revealed as a fragile edifice built on a faulty premise. He had been fighting a war on the wrong battlefield. He had been trying to build a better shield, while this woman had simply found a different world. He turned to face her. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, humbling desperation. He was a builder whose family had nearly frozen in a house he had built with his own hands. She was a widow who had saved her son with a hole in the ground. The great reversal was complete. He did not say, "I was wrong." He did not say, "I am sorry." He said something far more important. "Show me," he said, his voice cracking. "Show me the principles." And so she did. In the quiet of her subterranean home, with the wreckage of the great blizzard lying silent on the world above, Aniela Kowalski shared her wisdom. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of his mockery. She spoke of the earth's deep heat, of the frost line, of thermal mass. She spoke of the mines in her homeland and the cellars of her grandmothers. She explained not as a victor, but as a teacher, sharing a truth that was essential for their collective survival. He listened, no longer the town expert, but the first student of a new and ancient school of thought. The legacy of Aniela's folly was written across the landscape of Perseverance Creek over the next decade. Mr. Thompson, with his builder's knowledge and newfound humility, became the method's greatest champion. He helped Aniela refine the design, adding better ventilation, stronger supports, and safer entrances. Together, they helped other families dig their own. They became known as Kowalski Cellars, or sometimes Winter Havens. They were subterranean rooms of survival, dug into the hillsides or beneath the floors of existing cabins. No one in the settlement ever froze in their home again. The Kowalski Cellar became a symbol not of madness, but of resilience. It was an innovation born of necessity, guided by memory, and proven in the crucible of a legendary storm. Aniela Kowalski lived out her days as a quiet, respected pillar of the community she had once been an outcast from. She never sought praise, but she earned a reverence that few others knew. She had looked at a problem, the brutal Dakota winter, and had not accepted the conventional terms of the fight. She had sidestepped the battle entirely and found a deeper peace. She had understood a fundamental truth that her neighbors had missed. The greatest source of shelter was not the forest, cut down and stacked against the cold. It was the earth itself, vast, silent, and steady. Fire is not the gift. Heat is the gift. And the planet holds more of it than any fire could ever hope to produce. She did not invent a new technology. She simply remembered an old truth. She listened to the wisdom her ancestors had learned from generations of living with the land, not just upon it. She understood that sometimes the way forward is not to build higher, but to dig deeper. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and their experiences are a composite of the ingenuity shown by countless settlers and pioneers. The content presented here does not constitute professional engineering or architectural advice, but rather serves as a testament to the power of unconventional thinking. The principles of thermal mass and geothermal stability, however, are very real. They are a reminder that the most elegant solutions are often waiting just beneath our feet. What about you? What insurmountable winter are you facing in your own life? What conventional wisdom are you following that demands more and more of your energy for less and less warmth? What deep, forgotten knowledge lies within you? A memory from your own ancestors? A truth from a different land or a different time? Perhaps the solution is not to build a thicker wall against the storm. Perhaps it is to find the quiet, stable ground beneath the fury, and to simply, bravely, start digging.